Hi. Um, this is just a quick overview on the Bible study stuff that we did on Friday. If you get a chance, ask your group leader to just quickly watch the video um, that I showed of the author talking about an overview of the materials that we will cover. I think it's a very interesting video that he will show. He'll talk about, and we are going to use the prophets Elijah and Elijah, um, and, and especially he's talking about how do we find hope during these hard times. So that's what the Bible study is all about. So if you get a chance, ask um, your group leader to show that video. It's on YouTube. You can just watch it for about it's a 5 minutes video, so you can watch it, and then you can go from there. Um, you know a little bit of the story, how the kingdom of Israel evolved with God choosing Saul as their first king, and he, of course, failed in his rising up to what God had in mind. And then God chooses King David, and King David is probably the most decorated kings of all times. And after that, he's followed by King Solomon. But King Solomon was good, but he kind of failed in many ways. And so after after King Solomon, the kingdom gets divided into the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. The northern kingdom is Samaria, and the southern kingdom is Judah. Um, so there was a slight difference between the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. The southern kingdom, where the lineage was through dynasty. So King David and the descendants from David became the kings of the southern kingdom, while the northern kingdom was more of charisma. If somebody had a good charisma, God anointed him as leader, and once that charisma kind of left, God took the spirit and put it on the others. And so, in terms of king's choice, that's what it was all about. In terms of how they saw God, um, the southern kingdom saw God as the one who made a covenant with David, and so God resided in the temple, because for David, temple was the most important thing, and that's why Solomon built the temple. And so the God resided in the temple. So for southern kingdom, temple became the most important thing. And um, so God's faithfulness to King David was the most important thing. But for the northern kingdom was, they saw God, the one who delivered them from slavery, and had gone through the wilderness with them and have taken care of them in the wilderness. And so they saw God um, as somebody who moved along with them, the one who's a deliverer. So so they also saw God as the one who moved with them in the tabernacle. So it was not a fixed God, a God is in the fixed place, but God who moved. So the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom were very different, but the northern kingdom was very difficult to work with because of the kings. Many of them were not very faithful, and they had their own ways of doing. And to be a prophet during that time in the northern kingdom was extremely hard. And somebody said, very interestingly, that to be a prophet in the northern kingdom is a deathly business. So you had to confront power. If you look at the role of prophets had a very interesting role. Prophets were mouthpieces for God, and most of the time they kind of spoke on behalf of God, and so they were very, they stood against power, and and that's why the prophets were very scared to do it. But also, prophets became those things. So prophets became an example of how we need to be when God speaks things to us. What do I have to do? And so the kind of the prophet show is an example of all of that. And so that being said, we are looking at the life of Elijah. Now Elijah was a prophet who kind of enters into the scene in chapter 17 of First Kings. But before that, in chapter 16 of First Kings, they give you a little bit of overview of who the king is during that time. And it says it was Ahab and Jezebel. And so they were very ruthless in some ways. And here is a prophet out of nowhere. In chapter 17, if you see, it just says Elijah was a prophet from Tishbe of Tishbit and from Gilead. Now, there is not a whole lot of genealogy that is said. There's nothing that we know about Elijah. He just comes out of obscurity and is called to do God's work. So that's why sometimes prophets are like that. They come out of obscurity and God puts him to the limelight. And Elijah's one message to King Ahab was that until the Lord says a word, there will be drought in this land. And so after he says this to the king. Just imagine to tell something to the king. He's a powerful man. And so what he does is he just after he says that, he immediately runs and hides himself in a small wadi, it says, of Cherith. Now wadi is a dried up riverbed. And so Elijah runs and just hides himself in a wadi. And there he is sitting down there, and God feeds him through a raven. Now, ravens are very dirty birds. They are scavenger birds. You don't want to be fed by a scavenger bird. But that's how God takes care of Elijah. He feeds him in the morning and he feeds him in the evening. And so soon, what happens is the brook dries up. And now Elijah has to make a choice of what he wants to do. Now, what the author says in our book is that is the wilderness period of Elijah's life. Now, before, if you see, wilderness has got tremendous significance in the life of the people of Israel. Wilderness is where they begin to see God's hand in their lives. And wilderness is where they completely become dependent on God. There is no other way for them to get anything unless they are totally dependent on God. Now look at, for Elijah, he had to depend on God for his daily living, but God feeds them. So wilderness in your life and in my life is the place where God takes us out, makes us totally dependent on him. But that is the place also that we begin to realize that God is with us. God has never left us. And so the first part of your story is the first part of chapter 17, verses 1 through 6, I believe. And is where is where Elijah is in that place, and where it's in the wilderness that God teaches him how to depend. So you'll have those 3 questions or 2 questions that you can talk in your small groups. And right after that, from chapter 17, God asks him to go to a place called Zarephath in Sidon. Now Sidon is a place, it's an enemy territory. And God asks him to go to that place. And so he leaves and he goes to Sidon. Now Sidon, people of the Sidonians were never nice to Israel. They constantly bickered them, they worried about them, they annoyed them. And to that place God asks him to go. So he goes to this place, and there is complete drought in that place. There is no anything. And so as he enters the place, that he sees a widow picking up sticks. And if you get a chance, read that portion. It's just where Elijah has this audacity to go and ask this woman, and sees this woman picking sticks and say, "Hey, listen, can you get me some water? And then, by the way, get me something to eat." And so the woman also replies something that is very strange. She completely looks at the stranger and she says this one. She says, "Hey, listen, we don't have anything. There's a little bit of flour and this is the oil. I'm just picking up sticks so that I can go and cook. And then both of us are going to eat. My son and I are going to eat, and we're going to die." And so Elijah, lo and behold, he says to him, "Yeah, that's okay, but just give me something to eat." And so the woman goes and gives him something to, probably cooks and gives him something to eat. But then that's the power of that miracle is that the oil and the flour in that woman's house does not run dry for the whole 3 years of this drought. It's amazing, isn't it? Now, the story does continue a little bit. After she has fed and Elijah is staying there, the sun dies. See, the story is just powerfully beautiful because both the woman and Elijah has a need. Elijah's need was food to eat. The woman's need was a hope in her life because she's come to the dead end and she's finding hope. And for both of them, for the woman and Elijah, both have this amazing need to see God in their lives. Is that right? So the son dies, and so she's just honest before. She just tells Elijah, Why did you come to remind me of my sin? And so Elijah takes the son, and even as he takes the son, he goes to God and he just is honest before God. He just tells it as it is. God, why are you doing this to me? In both of their honesty, whether it's a woman's honesty or Elijah's honesty, they have not, it's just that they're being honest, does not mean that they are doubtful of what God can do in their lives. Sometimes that's the way we need to look at our lives. When it's just because we are honest before God does not mean we are doubtful of God's ability to do in our lives. And also, when the things in our lives are so scarce, and it's only very limited that we have, and oftentimes in times of crisis, what we do is we hold on to what we have. We don't let it go. But what in God's amazing economy is when we let go of those little bit that we have, God takes it and multiplies it. Does that in 5,000, the feeding of the 5,000, is it? And even for this widow, when she lets go of that little bit she has, God just multiplies it. Is that right? So that's your second story. And the second story is, the first one was in the wilderness, the second one was from the drought. And so then we move on to the chapter 18. Chapter 18. Now, you know the story. In chapter 18, Elijah confronts the prophets of Baal. Now, you just know that amazing story. But what caught my attention was the story that comes before at the very beginning of chapter 18. There is this guy called Obadiah. And if you go and read that portion, it's beautiful. Obadiah serves in King Ahab's court. But then it says in one small parenthesis, it says, but he feared God. And it says he went and hid almost like 300 prophets of Israel in a small cave and fed them. Now what Obadiah's role is so interesting. He is in the king's court, but yet he has a heart for God. And when he had to choose between the king and God, interestingly, he chooses God. And that's when you are working in a corporate setting and you know something that's not going right, and you know your values as a Christian, somebody who fears God, what would you do? And so Obadiah makes a choice for God. So the author is saying, who will you choose in those places? But then later on in that story that we know, the showdown that happens between the prophets of Baal and the prophets of Israel, or between Elijah. And so they build an altar, they put this one, and the prophets of Baal are just going there and just screaming their hearts out for their God to come and do. Nothing happens. And after that, Elijah says, hey, listen, can I call on my God? But before that, he says, pour water over the sacrifice. And it is soaking wet. It's not just once or twice, but thrice. And the place is soaking wet. And so now Elijah calls on God, and God comes and just sweeps all of the water and the sacrifice. And so he proves to them, hey, the God that I worship is this God. And if you want to follow him, if you don't want to follow him, listen. And so he takes the prophets and he kills them. And so it's a choice that we make, is it right? But that's not what got me in that story. What got me in the story that was very interesting was what he says is beautiful. Sometimes we think of the prophets of Baal and the prophets and Elijah as us and them, as if they are the other side and we are the ones who serve God. But what he says is the us and them reside in us. We have our own idols in our lives. So sometimes it's wealth, sometimes it's power. If you get a chance, look at a book by Tim Keller. It's called Counterfeit Gods. Now the counterfeit gods are not outside of us. Counterfeit gods are inside of us. They constantly are asking for allegiance of our lives. What will we choose? So the story is not about what Elijah chooses or the prophets of Baal chooses, but both of them live in us, and they are on constant fight in our lives. When those choices that we have to make, who will you choose? Whether you will choose to serve God or you will choose to serve the idol of your making. So that's your little bit of an overview of what I did. And you have a couple of questions for each one of them. For the first story, you have a couple of questions. For the second story, you have a couple of, and for the third story, you have a couple of questions. So enjoy the study. Take time to just be honest with each other, because this is a small group. Just be honest with each other. Enjoy the study and wrestle with it, and ask deeper questions of your life. Ask questions: what does it mean for me and for my family who are living in this time and space? So that's your little bit of an overview. I hope this is helpful. If you have a question, just shoot out a question to me, and I hope your team leads will take and have a great time together. So thank you so much. Blessings on all that you do. Bye for now.